In the name of God, hello everybody. This is session 3 of your morphology lesson. As you know, in the previous session, I talked about the two approaches to morphological, phenomena. First of all, we talk about the analytic approach, then the synthetic approach. Then at the last part of the second session, I talked about the two principles of analytic approach, which which belongs to NIDA's approach. The first principle, which says us that principle number 1 of NIDA, says that forms with the same meaning and the same sound shape in all the occurrences or instances of the same morpheme. And the second principle told us that forms with the same meaning but different sound shapes may be instances of the same morpheme if their distribution do not overlap, like the plural form, the plural morpheme in the English language. For example, we have s, z, s, n, and the empty as the signs of the plural morphemes. So I want to talk about the principle number 3 in this session, which says us that not all morphemes are segmental. What this means, normally when we think of morphemes, we think of forms that can be pronounced in some sense. For example, chicken. Look at this example. For example, chicken, or there, or on. But some morpheme cannot be pronounced on their own. They are dependent on other morpheme for their realization. In English, for example, vowel alternation may serve to differentiate basic and past form of the verb. We refer to this alternation as ablaut. Okay, so look at this example: run, ran, speak, spoke, eat, ate. You see this? We know that there is a past tense marker distinguishing the words in the second column from those in the first. But what is it? It is not the a, for example. We cannot say that a is the sign of the past tense, or o here is the sign of the past tense, but rather the difference between these vowels and the vowels of the basic verb, which is not segmental at all. So this is not segmental. We cannot break it down to two parts and we say that the first one is the stem and the second one is the past sign of past verb in the English language. So we must look at both the present and past tense forms of these verbs, because it is the contrast between them that is important. Another type, look at another example. Another type of non-segmental morpheme in English is shown in this example. Breathe as a noun, breathe as a verb. Clothe, clothe. House, house. In each pair, the noun ends in a voiceless fricative s or th, while the verb in a voiced fricative th or z. Assuming that the noun is basic, so here this column is basic, we say that the morpheme that marks the verbs consists of the phonological feature plus voice. So this is again non-segmental. Although principle 3 says that we can apply the term morpheme to the non-segmental alternations seen in the previous examples, doing so is awkward. Pairs like run, ran, breathe, breeze are more easily explained as processes, not as the concatenations of morphemes. In the next chapters, we will further address this issue. So this is the principle number 3. So principle number 4, the contrast between the forms we said in the previous examples. The notion of contrast can be further extended, leading to principle number 4. So I want to talk about principle number 4 of NIDA's principle. A morpheme may have 0 as one of its allomorphs, provided it has a non-zero allomorph. Fish, for example, generally displays no special marking in the plural. You know, fish, I mean here, doesn't have any plural sign, but this is maybe in some context maybe plural. One fish, for example, we say one fish. When we want to say 10 fish, again we say 10 fish with an empty sign for showing the the plural form. We can say that it has a zero plural, and that this zero plural is an allomorph of the usual plural z, because other words in the language like frogs have non-zero plurals. This is an analytic procedure, not a theoretical point. We cannot posit a zero unless it contrasts with some non-zero variants. In Japanese, where sakana means both fish and, for example, fish as a singular and plural, we cannot posit a zero plural because nowhere in the language does the empty form of plural contrast with the non-zero allomorph. So this is the principal number form. A morpheme may have zero as one of its allomorph if it has a non-zero allomorph, like the fish in English language, because we have s as a plural form like frogs in English. So this empty sign is a kind of allomorph of the plural form morpheme. So this is principle number 4. So we have 4 principles of NIDA's principles about the analytic approaches to morphology, and we talk about these 4 principles. So if I ask you about these principles, you can talk about these 4 principles, and you can use, for example, Arabic example to show and to explain these principles. Sample problems with solutions. Now that you have been introduced to some principles of morphological analysis, let us examine a data set, for example. This one comes from the dialect of some dialect of Mexico and is taken from NIDA again. Look at this example. It becomes from a dialect from Mexico. So for example, ikal wewe, it means his big house. Ikal sosol, his old house. Ikal sin, his little house, and the other problems. Our task is to list all the morphemes and to give the meaning of each. So before reading the following discussion, try this out on your own. Okay, look at it, and then if you run into trouble or want to check your answer, read on, okay, the other parts of this discussion. So look at it. You can guess what the morphemes of this language the morphemes are. So I explain it to you. We begin by looking for recurring pieces that have a consistent meaning or function. For example, consider number 21A to C. Look at it. Ikal wewe, ikal sosol, ikal chin. You see there is some, the same morpheme, ikal. You see here, which its mean is house. His big house, his old house, his little house. So ikal means house. We can break it down to 2 parts because this part, ikal, are the same in these 3 words. So we can conclude that these 3 morphemes, which are the same, ikal, 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 is its meaning is house. So all have something to do with house, and more specifically maybe his house. Examining the forms carefully, we find that they all contain the piece ikal, so but have nothing else in common. We deduce from this that ikal means his house. So we include a hyphen after ikal because since it never appears on its own. So this is the first, for example, the first morpheme. We can divide it and guess the meaning of it based on the meaning of the the translation of English language. Again, for example, form 20 A1, A, 21A, equal Wewe. You see here his big house. Contain an additional, morpheme, Wewe, which it means is, big. We can find it in another words. For example, this one, the G form, peta wewe, big mat. You see here, it means is again big. So because of these two words, for example, equal wewe and petat wewe, we conclude that wewe means big in this language. So and so on. You can, break it down in these words to its, morphemes, and by comparing the words to each other and by finding the same morphemes in these words, and by looking at the English translation, you can find the meaning of these words. This is a kind of analytic approach to the word. This is an unfamiliar word for us, so by comparing the recurring morphemes and looking at the translation, you can divide these words to their morphemes. And this is the morphemes of this Mexican dialect. Ikal means his house, kamit means cooking pot. For example, koyame means pig, and the other morphemes you can break it down and you can conclude the meaning of these morphemes. So this is the first exercise. You can do it by yourself in the house. Our next sample problem set comes from, for example, French. This is another example. We can look at it in for guessing the morphemes of this language. Again, we are not familiar with French language, so it addresses different issues than the the Mexican dialect discussed above. The French adjectives in the first column are masculine, as you see here, and those in the second are feminine. Okay, you see here. Your task is to determine how masculine and feminine adjectives are differentiated and to outline a possible analysis. You may ignore changes in vowel quality. Okay, you see, this is the masculine adjective, this is the feminine, and this is the English translation. As with the Mexican set, you should limit yourself to the data provided, although some of you may know French. One way to begin is to see whether there is a single morpheme which may or may not have allomorphs. For example, that signals the difference between masculine and feminine. There is not. Masculine and feminine adjectives are differentiated by an alternation between, for example, in the first one, empty and the S. You see here, this is the difference. In 23A, empty and Z. You see here in the second one and the third one, as you see. Empty and T in number 4. Empty and L in the other one, you see here. Empty and N in the other one, as you see here. Empty and G in the other one. And in the last one, as you see, both of them are empty. Net, you see here. The masculine and feminine forms of net, it means it's clean, are identical. So we cannot consider the many final sounds of the feminine form to be allomorphs of one another. Phonetically, they are extremely varied, as you see here. Their distribution overlaps too. For example, we find both, for example, sh and z after this vowel. You see here we have z here, and for example after this vowel we have sh. So they overlap each other in some examples. So we can say that there is no apparent reason why, for example, 23N, I mean the last one, net and net, should behave differently from the other words in the list in having only one form. You may be thinking that the spelling can account for the final sound of the feminine form. However, spelling, often reflects the history of the word and not its synchronic analysis. So far, it appears as if the final sound of the feminine form of the adjective is arbitrary, okay? And yet, it cannot be wholly arbitrary, or speakers would not know which form the feminine takes. We have been treating this problem until now as if the feminine form is derived from the masculine one. A second possibility is that the opposite is true. It means, the masculine form results as when we remove the final sound of the feminine. This account, for example, for example number 23A till M. But this hypothesis fails when we apply it to 23N, net, Both are pronounced net. Our current hypothesis that we arrive at the masculine form by subtracting the last segment of the feminine form cannot account for this fact. At this point in the problem, you need to make a new hypothesis. There is room for more than one. One is that in French, adjectives have more than one stem, and both the masculine and feminine stem needs to be memorized. This is the first, hypothesis. This would mean that for 23B, for example, these two adjectives, masculine and feminine, a speaker memorizes that the first is pronounced move and the second move, for example. A second reasonable hypothesis is that we were on the right track earlier and that the speakers arrive at the masculine form by dropping the final segment of the feminine form. We drop, the final part of the feminine and we conclude the masculine form. The feminine form is the only one that needs to be memorized. This is the second hypothesis. Then, since the masculine can be derived from it by regularly applying rule. Under this hypothesis, again, the last example, net, both pronounced net, is an exception that the speaker must memorize. Many would consider it an advantage that on the basis of our data set, this hypothesis requires speakers to memorize fewer forms. We may not have arrived at a single neat solution to the French data, you see, but we have analyzed them and presented the hypothesis that they suggest carefully. Presentation is important whenever you undertake to solve a linguistic problem. We close this section with a few tips for writing one up. First, when you include examples from a data set in the text of your analysis, set them off by underlining them or using italics as we have done. Second, whenever you present a foreign language form provided its gloss, the most standard linguistic practice is to put the gloss in single quotation marks like this. Definition, you see here, for example, fat, bad, and finally, be sure you know what the problem is asking. If the problem asks for a list of morphemes, that is all you need to provide. If the problem asks for your analysis, present it carefully, as we have done above. In order to make your answer more compelling, you may need to explore analyses that do not work as well. This is what we did in examining the French data. So this is the French data. You see that there are some problems. We have three hypotheses. First of all, we should, for example, memorize both masculine and feminine adjectives. This is difficult. The second hypothesis is the masculine. We have masculine forms in our head and our brain, and we should add some suffixes to produce feminine. But as you see, there are some different suffixes to produce feminine adjective. And the third hypothesis, which is better than these two, the previous two hypotheses, is that we have feminine forms in our heads, and by dropping the last part of the feminine adjectives we produce a masculine form. But we have some exceptional form like the net, which we should memorize them in our brain. And this is the, but you see that there are some problems in French analysis work. So these are two examples from the Mexico and the French. You can break the morphemes, break them down, and you can guess the meaning of the morphemes, and you can guess the morphemes of that unfamiliar language. This is the kind of analytic approach based on NIDA's approaches, 4 principles, which I talked about them. So in this chapter, we have given some introduction to the field of morphology and to some of the phenomena that morphologists study. We introduce the key notions that of the morpheme, for example, by acknowledging some problems with this traditional formulation. Then presented some basic beliefs of ours that underlie this and other chapters of the book, as well as 4 principles that will help the reader undertake morphological analysis by NIDA. Finally, we lead the reader through 2 sample problems in order to illustrate the steps morphologists must take when analyzing data, as well as possible stumbling blocks that he or she might encounter. Then we next turn to an introduction to some examples from other languages. So this is the chapter number 1, which introduced the notion of morphology, the morphemes, morphs, and then we talk about 2 approaches to morphology, analytic and synthetic. Then we talk about some beliefs about the morphological analysis in this book. Then we talk about the NIDA's principles. We have 4 principles which introduced by NIDA, and then we have 2 samples from Mexico and French to understand those principles in this example. As you see, we have some problems in analyzing the data. So we can check these phenomena in your language, for example, your Arabic language, English language, Persian language, to to understand these notions which I introduced in this chapter number 1. Okay, that's enough. This is the end of the chapter 1. In the next session, I will talk about some other phenomena in chapter 2, which talks about the words and lexemes. And that's enough for today. Thank you for your attention, and goodbye, everybody.